If you're fascinated by how European power politics shaped American independence, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're bringing you the untold stories of how America was really won, not just on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power across the Atlantic. The alliance with France gave the United States a respite from active war, but that respite came at a terrible price. The forced acceptance of irredeemable paper money as legal tender necessarily wrecked public credit and impaired private contracts and debts. The British officials had circulated counterfeits so widely that Congress in January 1779 was compelled to recall two separate emissions, each of 5 millions. The want of a central power paralyzed every effort at an organization of the strength of the collective states. Washington remained more than a month at Philadelphia in consultation with Congress. Fort Niagara and Detroit, as well as New York City, were in the possession of Britain. Yet all agreed that the country must confine itself to a defensive campaign. Even a defensive campaign was attended with difficulties. To leave the officers, by the depreciation of the currency, even without means to provide themselves with decent clothes and subsistence, augured the reduction of the army to a shadow. Few of them were willing to remain on the existing establishment, and Congress was averse to promising pensions to them or to their widows. To each of the rank and file who would agree to serve during the war, a bounty of $200 besides land and clothing was offered, while those who had in former years enlisted for the war received a gratuity of $100. Yet all would have been in vain but for the earnestness of the people. Congress never had any power. Now its authority was exhausted, and it could do nothing but appeal to the states. Tardily, in March, it voted that the infantry should consist of 80 battalions, of which 11 were assigned to Pennsylvania, as many to Virginia, and 15 to Massachusetts. No state furnished its whole quota, Massachusetts more nearly than any other. In addition to the congressional bounty, New Jersey paid $250 to each of her recruits. Often in Massachusetts, sometimes in Virginia, levies were raised by draft. 4 years of hard service and of reflection had ripened in Washington the conviction of the need of a truly efficient general government. To James Warren, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, he made appeals for the subordination of every selfish interest to the good of what he called our common country, America, our noble cause, the cause of mankind. To the men of Virginia, he addressed himself more freely. To one of them he wrote, "Our affairs have come to a crisis. Unanimity, disinterestedness, and perseverance in our national duty are the only means to avoid misfortunes." Before the end of March, in a letter sent by a private hand, he drew the earnest thoughts of George Mason to the ruin that was coming upon the country from personal selfishness and provincial separatism. "I have seen without despondency, even for a moment, the hours which America has styled her gloomy ones, but I have beheld no day since the commencement of hostilities that I have thought her liberties in such eminent danger as at present. Friends and foes seem now to combine to pull down the goodly fabric we have been raising at the expense of so much time, blood, and treasure. Indeed, we seem to be verging so fast to destruction that I am filled with sensations to which I have been a stranger till within these 3 months. I cannot refrain lamenting in the most poignant terms the fatal policy too prevalent in most of the states of employing their ablest men at home in posts of honor and profit till the great national interest is fixed on a solid basis." He repeated the illustration which he had already used with Harrison, showing how completely he had thought out the proper relations of the Union to the states by adhering to the words in which he had formulated them. To me, it appears no unjust simile to compare the affairs of this great continent to the mechanism of a clock, each state representing some one or other of its smaller parts, which they are endeavoring to put in fine order, without considering how useless and unavailing their labor is, unless the great wheel or spring which is to set the whole in motion is also well attended to and kept in good order. as it is a fact too notorious to be concealed that Congress is rent by party. No man who wishes well to the liberties of his country and desires to see its rights established can avoid crying out, "Where are our men of abilities? Why do they not come forth to save their country?" Let this voice, my dear sir, call upon you, Jefferson and others. Do not, from a mistaken opinion, let our hitherto noble struggle end in ignominy. Believe me when I tell you there is danger of it.
In May, he wrote to another friend, "I never was, and much less reason have I now to be, afraid of the enemy's arms, but I have no scruples in declaring to you that I have never yet seen the time in which our affairs, in my opinion, were at as low an ebb as at the present. Without a speedy and capital change, we shall not be able to call out the resources of the country." Count d'Estaing was filled with the idea of a joint expedition of his fleet and the American troops to give to the King of France Halifax and Newfoundland. To consult on this subject, Girard, in the first days of May, accepted an invitation from Washington to visit him in his camp. It was not possible for the United States to furnish a force sufficient to conquer and garrison Newfoundland. But on his return from the camp, the minister wrote to Count Vergennes, "I have had many conversations with General Washington, some of which have continued for 3 hours. It is impossible for me briefly to communicate the fund of intelligence which I have derived from him, but I shall do it in my letters as occasions shall present themselves. I will now say only that I have formed as high an opinion of the powers of his mind, his moderation, his patriotism, and his virtues, as I had before from common report conceived of his military talents and of the incalculable services he has rendered to his country." At this time, while Congress was lulling itself into the belief that hostilities were near their end, the special treaty between France and Spain was exposing America to new dangers. For Spain, as well as for France, the French envoy to the United States conducted with Congress a negotiation on the ultimate terms upon which the United States would be ready to make peace, and was specially commanded to mold them into a form acceptable to Spain. So long as France stood alone, Vergennes had been willing that the United States should treat with Great Britain on the basis of a simple recognition of American independence. But after the understanding with Spain, he required America to declare distinctly and roundly that it will listen to no proposition unless it has for its base peace with France as well. On the report of an able committee, among whom were Samuel Adams and Jay, Congress on the 14th of January 1779 resolved unanimously that as neither France nor these United States may of right, so they will not, conclude either truce or peace with the common enemy without the formal consent of their ally first obtained. This point having been gained, the envoy of France held up to America the desire to include Spain in a triple alliance against Great Britain, and for that end to induce the United States to shape their conditions of peace with Great Britain in accordance with the wishes of the French and Spanish monarchs. The conditions on which it was difficult to agree related to boundaries and to the fisheries. For Massachusetts, the fisheries had been the great and peculiar source of wealth in return for small outlays of capital, and to put this industry at hazard seemed to that state like periling its prosperity. With regard to the fisheries, no uniform rule had as yet been so settled by public law as to control treaties. By the Treaty of Utrecht, France agreed not to fish within 30 leagues of the coast of Nova Scotia, and by that of Paris, not to fish within 15 leagues of Cape Breton. New England, at the beginning of the war, had, as a punitive measure, been debarred by Act of Parliament from fishing on the banks of Newfoundland. What right of legislation respecting them would remain at the peace to the Parliament of England? The fishery on the high seas, so Vergennes always expounded the law of nations, is as free as the sea itself, and it is superfluous to discuss the right of the Americans to it. But the coast fisheries belong of right to the propriety of the coast. Therefore, the fisheries on the coasts of Newfoundland, of Nova Scotia, of Canada belong exclusively to the English, and the Americans have no pretension whatever to share in them. But the Americans had hitherto almost alone engaged in the fisheries on the coast of Nova Scotia and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The New England men had planned and had alone furnished land forces for the first reduction of Cape Breton and had assisted in the acquisition of Nova Scotia and Canada. The men of Massachusetts, therefore, claimed the fisheries on their coasts as a perpetual joint property. Against this, Vergennes argued that the conquest had been made for the crown of Great Britain, and the New England men, by choosing to be no longer the subjects of that crown, renounced all right to the coast fisheries.
To persuade Congress to propitiate Spain by conceding all her demands, the French envoy sought interviews with its newly appointed Committee on Foreign Affairs, which was composed of one from each state. He insisted with them on the relinquishment of the coast fisheries and of the left bank and the navigation of the Mississippi. It was answered that the land as far as the Mississippi was already colonized and held by Americans. He rejoined that personal considerations must give way to the general interests of the Republic, that the King of Spain, if he engaged in the war, would have equal rights with the United States to acquire territories of the King of England, that the persistence in asserting a right to establishments on the Ohio and the Illinois and at Natchez would exhibit an unjust desire of conquest, that such an acquisition was foreign to the principles of the American alliance with France and of the system of union between France and Spain, as well as inconsistent with the interests of the latter power. He formally declared that his king would not prolong the war one single day to secure to the United States the possessions which they coveted. Besides, the extent of their territory rendered already a good administration difficult. So enormous an increase would cause their immense empire to crumble under its own weight. Girard terminated his very long conversation by declaring the strongest desire that the United States might never be more than 13. On the 15th of February, Girard, in a private audience, represented to Congress that the price which Spain put upon her friendship was Pensacola and the exclusive navigation of the Mississippi. If her wishes were not complied with, there was danger that Spain and England might make common cause against America. 2 days after this private interview, Congress referred the subject of the terms of peace to a special committee of 5, composed of Gouverneur Morris of New York, Burke of North Carolina, Witherspoon of New Jersey, Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, and Smith of Virginia. On the 23rd, the committee reported their opinion that the King of Spain was disposed to enter into an alliance with the United States, and that consequently independence must be finally acknowledged by Great Britain. This being effected, they proposed as their ultimatum that their territory should extend from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the Floridas to Canada and Nova Scotia, that the right of fishing and curing fish on the banks and coasts of Nova Scotia, the banks of Nova Scotia and Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Straits of Labrador and Belle Isle should in no case be given up. By the efforts of Gerry, who was from Marblehead, Richard Henry Lee was able to bring up the subject anew. Avoiding a collision with the monopoly of France, he proposed that the right of fishing on the coasts and banks of North America should be reserved to the United States as fully as they enjoyed the same when subject to Great Britain. This substitute prevailed by the vote of Pennsylvania and Delaware with the 4 New England states. But the state of New York, guided by Jay and Gouverneur Morris, altogether refused to insist in the Treaty of Peace on the right to the fisheries. Gouverneur Morris, on the 8th of May, calling to mind the exhausted situation of the United States, the derangement of their finances, and the defect of their resources, moved that the acknowledgement of independence should be the sole condition of peace.
The motion was declared out of order by the votes of the 4 New England states, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, against the unanimous delegations of New York, Maryland, and North Carolina, while Delaware, Virginia, and South Carolina were equally divided.
The French minister intervened. On the 27th of May, Congress went back to its first resolve that by no treaty of peace should the common right of fishing be given up. On the 3rd of June, Gerry again appeared as the champion of the American right to the fisheries on banks or coasts as exercised during their political connection with Great Britain. He was in part supported by Sherman, but New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island were left by Connecticut, and though Pennsylvania came to their aid, the Gallican Party, by a vote of 7 states against the 4, set aside the main question. The necessity of appeals to France for aid promoted obsequiousness to its wishes. On the 15th of June, 1779, Congress solicited supplies from its ally to the value of nearly $3 million to be paid for with interest after the peace. 4 days later, Gerry, evading a breach of the rules of Congress by a change in form, moved resolutions that the United States have a common right with the English to the fisheries on the banks of Newfoundland and the other fishing banks and seas of North America. A most stormy and acrimonious debate ensued. The Friends of France resisted the resolutions as sure to alienate Spain and contrary to the general longing for peace. 4 states read a sketch of their protest on the subject. Congress gave way in part, but by the votes of the 4 New England states and Pennsylvania against New York, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, with New Jersey, Delaware, and South Carolina divided, they affirmed the common right of the Americans to fish on the Grand Banks. For this right, to which Versailles owned their indisputable title, they asked the guarantee of France in the form of an explanatory article of existing treaties. The persevering French minister sought an interview with President Jay and 2 other members of Congress well disposed to the wishes of France. Finding them inclined to yield to New England, he remarked that disunion from the side of New England was not to be feared, for its people carried their love of independence even to delirium. He added, there would seem to be a wish to break the connection of France with Spain, but I think I can say that if the Americans should have the boldness to force the King of France to choose between the 2 alliances, his decision will not be in favor of the United States. He will certainly not expose himself to consume the remaining resources of the kingdom for many years only to secure an increase of fortune to a few shipmasters of New England. I shall greatly regret on account of the Americans should Spain enter into the war without a convention with them. The interview lasted from 8 o'clock in the evening till an hour after midnight, but Jay and his friends would not themselves change the opinion of Congress. The result was a new interview on the 12th of July between Girard and members of Congress in Committee of the Whole. Of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, 8 accepted the French policy. Jay, with other members, gained over votes from the anti-Gallican side. After long debates and many divisions, the proposition to stipulate a right to the fisheries in the Treaty of Peace was indefinitely postponed by the votes of 8 states against New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, Georgia alone being absent. As to the future boundaries of the United States, Spain passionately desired to recover the Floridas so as to have the whole shore of the Gulf of Mexico. The United States had no traditional wish for their acquisition, and from the military point of view, Washington preferred that Spain should possess them rather than Great Britain. Here, therefore, no serious difficulty arose. But Spain dreaded the extension of the United States to the Mississippi. The Quebec Act had transferred to Canada the territory west and northwest of the Ohio.
Spain indulged the hope that England would insist on its right to that region, but as to the Americans, their backwoodsmen were already settled in the country, and it would have been easier to extirpate the game in its forests than to drive the American settlers from their homes. Spain, with the support of France, wished that the country northwest of the Ohio River should be guaranteed to Great Britain, but such a proposition could never gain a hearing in Congress. France, renouncing for herself all pretensions to Canada and Nova Scotia, joined Spain in opposing every wish of the Americans to acquire them. In this, Congress acquiesced.
The French minister desired to persuade Congress to be willing to end the war by a truce, after the precedents of the Swiss cantons and the United Netherlands. Burke of North Carolina, seconded by Duane of New York, wished no more than that independence should be tacitly acknowledged. But Congress required that previous to any treaty of peace, the independence of the United States should, on the part of Great Britain, be assured. Further, Girard wished America to bring about the accession of Spain to the alliance by trusting implicitly to the magnanimity of the Spanish king. Otherwise, he said, you will prevent His Catholic Majesty from joining in our common cause and from completing the intended triumvirate. Congress escaped from an immediate decision by resolving to send a plenipotentiary of its own to Spain. The minister to be chosen to negotiate a peace was, by a unanimous vote, directed to require Great Britain to treat with the United States as sovereign, free, and independent, and the independence was to be confirmed by the treaty. Nova Scotia was desired, but the negotiator might leave the northeastern boundary to be adjusted by commissioners after the peace. The guarantee of an equal common right to the fisheries was declared to be of the utmost importance, but was not made an ultimatum except in the instructions for the Treaty of Commerce with England. At the same time, the American minister at the court of France was directed to concert with that power a mutual guarantee of their rights in the fisheries as enjoyed before the war. The plan for a treaty with the King of Spain lingered a month longer. On the 17th of September, Congress offered to guarantee to him the Floridas if they should fall into his power, provided always that the United States should enjoy the free navigation of the Mississippi into and from the sea. The great financial distress of the states was to be made known to him in the hope of a subsidy or a guarantee of a loan to the amount of $5 million. On the 26th, Congress proceeded to ballot for the minister to negotiate peace, John Adams being nominated by Laurens of South Carolina, while Smith of Virginia proposed Jay, who was favored by the French ministry. On 2 ballots, no election was made. A compromise reconciled the rivalry. Jay, on the 27th, was elected envoy to Spain. The formally civil letter in which Vergennes bade farewell to John Adams on his retiring from Paris was read in Congress in proof that he would be most acceptable to the French ministry. Directly contrary to its wishes, he was chosen to negotiate the Treaty of Peace as well as an eventual Treaty of Commerce with Great Britain. In December 1778, Marie Antoinette, after many years of an unfruitful marriage, gave birth to a daughter. Congress, in June 1779, congratulating the King of France on the event, asked for the portraits of himself and his royal consort to be placed in their council chamber. This was not an act of adulation. The Americans took part in the happiness of Louis XVI. An honest impulse of gratitude gave his name to the city which overlooks the falls of the Ohio. When, in 1781, a son was born to him, Pennsylvania commemorated the event in the name of one of its counties. The compulsory inactivity of the British Army at the North encouraged discontent and intrigues. There rose up in rivalry with Clinton a body styling themselves the Loyal Associated Refugees, who were impatient to obtain an independent organization under Tryon and William Franklin. They insisted that more alertness would crush the rebellion.
They loved to recommend the employment of savages, the confiscation of the wealthy property of rebels, and even their execution or exile. The Virginians, since the expulsion of Lord Dunmore, free from war within their own borders, were enriching themselves by the unmolested culture of tobacco, which was exported through the Chesapeake, or, when that highway was unsafe, by a short land carriage to Albemarle Sound. On the 9th of May, 2,000 men under General Matthew, with 500 Marines, anchored in Hampton Roads. The next day, after occupying Portsmouth and Norfolk, they burned every house but one in Suffolk County and seized or ruined all perishable property. Parties from a sloop of war and privateers entered the principal waters of the Chesapeake, carried off or wasted stores of tobacco heaped on their banks, and burned the dwellings of the planters. Before the end of the month, the predatory expedition, having destroyed more than 100 vessels, arrived at New York with 17 prizes and 3,000 hogsheads of tobacco.
The legislature of Virginia, which was in session at Williamsburg during the invasion, retaliated by confiscating the property of British subjects within the Commonwealth. An act of a previous session had directed debts due to British subjects to be paid into the loan office of the state. To meet the public exigencies, a heavy poll tax was laid on all servants or slaves, as well as a tax payable in cereals, hemp, inspected tobacco, or the like commodities. The issue of £1 million in paper money was authorized. Everyone who would serve at home or in the Continental Army during the war was promised a bounty of $750, an annual supply of clothing, and 100 acres of land at the end of the war. Pensions were promised to disabled soldiers and to the widows of those who should find their death in the service. Half pay for life was voted to the officers. Each division of the militia was required to furnish for the service one able-bodied man out of every 25 to be drafted by fair and impartial lot. The code in which Jefferson, Wythe, and Pendleton adapted the laws of Virginia to reason, the welfare of the whole people, and the republican form of government was laid before the legislature. The law of descents abolished the rights of primogeniture and distributed real as well as personal property equally among brothers and sisters. The punishment of death was forbidden except for treason and murder. A bill was brought in to organize schools in every county at the expense of its inhabitants in proportion to the general tax rates, but in time of war and in the scattered state of the inhabitants, it was not possible to introduce a thorough system of universal education. The preamble to the bill for establishing religious freedom, written by Jefferson, declared that belief depends not on will but follows evidence, that God hath created the mind free, that temporal punishment or civil incapacitations only beget hypocrisy and meanness, that the impious endeavor of fallible legislators and rulers to impose their own opinions on others hath established and maintained false religions, that to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion destroys all religious liberty, that truth is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. It was therefore proposed to be enacted by the General Assembly, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his belief. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And we do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind. These words of Jefferson on the freedom of conscience expressed the forming convictions of the people of the United States. The enactment was delayed that the great decree which made the leap from an established church to the largest liberty of faith and public worship might be adopted after calm deliberation and with popular approval.
Virginia used its right of original and complete legislation to abolish the privileges of primogeniture, cut off entails, forbid the slave trade, and establish the principle of freedom in religion as the inherent and inalienable possession of spiritual being. The British expedition to the Chesapeake, after its return to New York, joined a detachment conducted by Clinton himself 40 miles up the Hudson to gain possession of Stony Point and Verplancks Point. The garrison withdrew from their unfinished work at Stony Point. The commander at Verplancks Point, waiting to be closely invested by water, on the 2nd of June made an inglorious surrender. The two posts commanded King's Ferry. The British fortified and garrisoned them, and so left the Americans no line of communication between New York and New Jersey south of the Highlands.
A pillaging expedition sent to punish the patriotism of Connecticut was entrusted to Tryon. The fleet and transports arrived off New Haven. At 2 in the morning of the 5th of July, one party landed suddenly on the west of the town, another on the east. Everything was abandoned to plunder. Vessels in the harbor, public stores, and the warehouses near the Sound were destroyed by fire. The soldiers, demoralized by license, lost all discipline, and the next morning retired before the Connecticut militia, who left them no time to burn the town. At East Haven, where Tryon commanded, dwelling houses were fired and cattle wantonly killed. Some of the unarmed inhabitants were put to death, others carried away as prisoners, but the British were driven to their ships. On the afternoon of the 7th, the expedition landed near Fairfield. The village, a century and a quarter old, situated near the water with a lovely country for its background, contained a moral, well-educated, industrious, and affluent people of nearly unmixed English lineage, well-ordered homes, freeholders as heads of families. An Episcopal church stood by the side of the larger meeting house. The husbandmen who came together were too few to withstand the unforeseen onslaught. The Hessians were let loose to plunder, and every dwelling was given up to be stripped. Before the sun went down, the firing of houses began and was kept up through the night amid the cries of distressed women and helpless children. Early the next morning, the conflagration was made general. When, at the return of night, the retreat was sounded, the rear guard, composed of Germans, set in flames the meeting house and every private habitation that till then had escaped. At Green Farms, a meeting house and all dwellings and barns were consumed. On the 11th, the British appeared before Norwalk and burned its houses, barns, and places of public worship. Sir George Collier and Tryon, the British admiral and general, in their address to the inhabitants of Connecticut, said the existence of a single habitation on your defenseless coast ought to be a constant reproof to your ingratitude. New London was selected as the next victim, but Tryon, who had already lost nearly 150 men, was recalled to New York by a disaster which had befallen the British. No sooner had they strongly fortified themselves at Stony Point than Washington, after ascertaining the character of their works, formed a plan to take them by surprise. Wayne, of whom he made choice to lead the enterprise, undertook the perilous office with alacrity and devised improvements in the method of executing the design. Stony Point, a hill just below the Highlands, projects into the Hudson, which surrounds 3/4 of its base. The fourth side was covered by a marsh, over which there lay but one pathway. Where this road joined the river, a sandy beach was left bare at low tide. The fort, which was furnished with heavy ordnance and garrisoned by 600 men, crowned the hill. Halfway between the river and the fort, there was a double row of abatis. Breastworks and strong batteries could rake any column which might advance over the beach and the marsh. From the river, vessels of war commanded the foot of the hill.
Conducting 1,200 chosen men in single file over mountains and through morasses and narrow passes, Wayne halted them at a distance of 1.5 miles from the enemy, while with the principal officers he reconnoitered the works. About 20 minutes after 12 on the morning of the 16th, the assault began, the troops placing their sole dependence on the bayonet. 2 advance parties of 20 men each, in one of which 17 out of the 20 were killed or wounded, removed the abatis and other obstructions. Wayne, leading on a regiment, was wounded in the head, but, supported by his aides, still went forward. The 2 columns, heedless of musketry and grape-shot, gained the center of the works nearly at the same moment. On the right, Fleury struck the enemy's standard with his own hand and was instantly joined by Stuart, who commanded the van of the left. 543 British officers and privates were made prisoners. The achievement was in its kind the most brilliant of the war. The diminishing numbers of the troops with Washington not permitting him to hold Stony Point, the cannon and stores were removed and the works razed. The post was soon reoccupied, but only for a short time, by a larger British garrison. The enterprising spirit of Major Henry Lee of Virginia had been applauded in general orders. His daring proposal to attempt the fort at Paulus Hook, now Jersey City, obtained the approval of Washington. The place was strong, but was carelessly guarded. The party with Lee was undiscovered until in the morning of the 19th of August, before day, they plunged into the canal, then deep from the rising tide. Entering the main work through a fire of musketry from blockhouses, they captured the fort before the discharge of a single piece of artillery. After daybreak, they withdrew, taking with them 159 prisoners. Incited by the massacres of Wyoming and Cherry Valley, Congress on the 25th of February had directed Washington to protect the inland frontier and chastise the Seneca Indians. Of the 2 natural routes to their country, that of the Susquehanna was selected for 3,000 men of the best Continental troops who were to rally at Wyoming, while 1,000 or more of the men of New York were to move from the Mohawk River. Before they could be ready, a party of 500 or 600 men, led by Van Schaik and Willett, made a swift march of 3 days into the country of the Onondagas and, without the loss of a man, destroyed their settlement. The command of the great expedition, which Gates declined, devolved on Sullivan, to whom Washington in May gave repeatedly the instruction, "Move as light as possible even from the first onset. Reject every article that can be dispensed with. This is an extraordinary case and requires extraordinary attention." Yet Sullivan made insatiable demands on the government of Pennsylvania and wasted time in finding fault and writing strange theological essays. Meanwhile, British and Indian partisans near Fort Schuyler surprised and captured 29 mowers. Savages under MacDonell laid waste the west bank of the Susquehanna till the Indians, by his own report, were glutted with plunder, prisoners, and scalps. 30 miles of a closely settled country were burnt. Brant and his crew consumed with fire all the settlement of Minisink, one fort excepted, and from a party by whom they were pursued took more than 40 scalps and 1 prisoner. The best part of the season was gone when Sullivan, on the last of July, moved from Wyoming. His arrival at Tioga sent terror to the Indians. Several of their chiefs said to Colonel Bolton in council, "Why does not the great king, our father, assist us? Our villages will be cut off, and we can no longer fight his battles." On the 22nd of August, the day after Sullivan was joined by New York troops under General James Clinton, he began the march up the Tioga into the heart of the Indian country. On the same day, Little David, a Mohawk chief, delivered a message from himself and the Six Nations to Haldimand, then governor of Canada. "Brother, for these 3 years past the Six Nations have been running a race against fresh enemies and are almost out of breath. Now we shall see whether you are our loving, strong brother or whether you deceive us.
"Brother, we are still strong for the King of England, if you will show us that he is a man of his word, and that he will not abandon his brothers, the Six Nations." The march into the country of the Senecas on the left extended to Genesee. On the right, detachments reached Cayuga Lake. After destroying 18 villages and their fields of corn, Sullivan returned to New Jersey. A small party from Fort Pitt, under command of Colonel Broadhead, broke up the towns of the Senecas upon the upper branch of the Allegheny. The manifest inability of Great Britain to protect the Six Nations taught them to desire neutrality. In June, the British General Maclean, who commanded in Nova Scotia, established a post of 600 men at what is now Castine on Penobscot Bay. To dislodge the intruders, the Massachusetts legislature sent 19 armed ships, sloops, and brigs, 2 of them Continental vessels, the rest privateers or belonging to the state. The flotilla carried more than 300 guns and was attended by 24 transports having on board nearly 1,000 men. So large an American armament had never put to sea. The towns on the coast spared no sacrifice to ensure success. On the 28th of July, the expedition gallantly effected their landing, but were too weak to carry the works of the British by storm. While a reinforcement was on the way, Sir George Collier, on the 14th of August, arrived in a 64-gun ship attended by 5 frigates. 2 vessels of war fell into his hands. The rest and all the transports ran up the river and were burnt by the men of the expedition, who made their escape through the woods. The British were left masters of the country east of the Penobscot. Yet the result of the campaign at the north promised success to America. Clinton had evacuated Rhode Island, and all New England west of the Penobscot was free of an enemy. In New York, the Six Nations had learned that the alliance with the English secured them gifts, but not protection. On the Hudson River, the Americans recovered the use of King's Ferry and held all the country above it.
The winter set in early and with unwanted severity. Before the middle of December, and long before the army could build their log huts, the snow lay 2 feet deep in New Jersey, where the troops were cantoned, so that they saved themselves with difficulty from freezing by keeping up large fires. Continental money was valued at no more than 30 for one, and even at that rate, the country people took it unwillingly. There could be no regularity in supplies. Sometimes the army was 5 or 6 days together without bread, at other times as many without meat, and once or twice 2 or 3 days without either. But such was the efficiency of the magistrates of New Jersey, such the good disposition of its people, that when requisitions were made by the commander-in-chief on its several counties, they were punctually complied with, and in some counties exceeded. For many of the soldiers, the term of service expired with the year. Shorter enlistments, by which several states attempted to fill their quotas, were fatal to compactness and stability. Massachusetts offered a bounty of $500 to each of those who would enlist for 3 years or the war, and found few to accept the offer. The Americans wanted men and wanted money, but could not be subdued. An incalculable strength lay in reserve in the energy of the states and of each individual citizen. Neither Congress nor people harbored a doubt of their ultimate triumph. Thomas Pownall, a member of Parliament who from long civil service in various parts of the United States knew them thoroughly well, published in England a memorial about them addressed to the sovereigns of Europe. The system of establishing colonies in various climates to create a monopoly of the peculiar product of their labor is at end. The spirit of commerce hath become predominant. A great and powerful empire, founded in nature and growing into an independent, organized being, has taken its equal station with the nations upon earth. I see the sun rising in the west. The independence of America is fixed as fate. She is mistress of her own fortune, knows that she is so, and will establish her own system and constitution and change the system of Europe. In this new world, growth is founded in the civilizing activity of the human race. We see all the inhabitants not only free, but allowing a universal naturalization.
In a country like this, where every man has the full and free exertion of his powers, an unabated application, and a perpetual struggle sharpen the wits and give constant training to the mind. In this wilderness of woods, the settlers try experiments, and the advantages of their discoveries are their own. One sees them laboring after the plow, as though they had not an idea beyond the ground they dwell upon, yet is their mind all the while enlarging its powers, and their spirit rises as their improvements advance. This is no fancy drawing of what may be, it is an exact portrait of what actually exists. Many a real philosopher, a politician, a warrior emerge out of this wilderness as the seed rises out of the ground where it hath lain buried for its season. In agriculture, in mechanic handicrafts, the New World hath been led to many improvements of implements, tools, and machines, leading experience by the hand to many values, in some cases of how to work with less labor, and finally of saving time, constantly leading to new discoveries. The alliance between France and the United States was more than a military partnership. It was a statement to the world that the age of unchallenged British dominance was ending. It was a declaration that the principles of liberty and self-governance could find champions even among the crowned heads of Europe. It was proof that a people united in their cause could attract the support of nations far beyond their shores.
For France, the alliance represented both opportunity and danger. The opportunity to strike back at their ancient rival, to reclaim their position as a great power, to open new avenues of trade and influence. The danger of bankruptcy, of encouraging revolutionary principles that might one day turn inward, of embarking on a war whose outcome remained uncertain. For America, the alliance meant survival. Without French money, French arms, French ships, and eventually French soldiers, the Continental Army could not have sustained its struggle. The loans from France kept the revolution financially afloat, even as Congress struggled to raise taxes and the states failed to meet their obligations. The military supplies from French arsenals equipped armies that would have otherwise fought with empty hands. The French Navy would eventually challenge British control of the seas and make possible the decisive victory at Yorktown. But the alliance also bound America to the diplomatic intrigues of Europe, to the ambitions of the Bourbon family, to calculations of power and prestige that had nothing to do with the principles for which Americans were fighting. Spain remained aloof, unwilling to support a republic, fearful that American independence would threaten its own colonial empire. The Spanish court looked upon the revolutionaries with suspicion, seeing in them not heroes of liberty, but dangerous examples that might inspire rebellion in Mexico, Peru, and the other jewels of the Spanish crown. The internal contradictions that plagued both Britain and France would shape the course of the war and the peace that followed. Britain, with a superior navy, vast resources, and a professional army, could not bring its full power to bear because its government was divided, its strategy confused, its leadership inadequate. France, embracing the cause of Republican liberty abroad, remained an absolute monarchy at home, its finances strained to the breaking point, its society moving inexorably toward the revolutionary upheaval that would consume the very monarchs who had supported American independence. Washington understood these complexities better than most. He knew that the alliance with France was born of calculation, not sentiment. He knew that French support could be withdrawn if circumstances changed. He knew that America must prove itself worthy of that support by demonstrating that its armies could fight, that its cause could endure, that its commitment to independence was absolute. That is why the performance of the Continental Army at Monmouth mattered so much. It was a message to France that their investment was sound, a message to Britain that the war could not be won, a message to wavering Americans that victory was possible. The battle also exposed the cancer of treason that had infected the American command.
Lee's conduct at Monmouth was so egregiously incompetent, so contrary to every principle of military leadership, that it could only be explained as deliberate sabotage. His subsequent defiance of Washington, his continued contact with British officers, his ultimate advocacy for reconciliation with Britain all confirmed what many had long suspected. He was a traitor who had wormed his way into a position of high command and very nearly succeeded in destroying the Continental Army at a critical moment. The contrast between Lee and Lafayette could not have been starker. Lee, the supposed professional soldier with years of European military experience, revealed himself as a coward and a fraud. Lafayette, the young French nobleman who had crossed the ocean at his own expense to fight for American liberty, proved himself a capable and courageous commander. Lee sought to undermine Washington at every turn. Lafayette regarded Washington with reverence and became like a son to him. Lee ended his days in disgrace, embittered and alone. Lafayette earned immortal glory and the gratitude of two nations. The evacuation of Philadelphia marked the effective end of Britain's offensive strategy in the northern states. Howe had captured the rebel capital and held it through the winter, yet this achievement meant nothing. The Continental Congress simply moved to another location and continued its work. The British had learned what would be demonstrated again and again in the history of warfare. Occupying territory is not the same as defeating an enemy. Taking cities is not the same as breaking the will of a people. As long as Washington's army remained in the field, as long as state governments continued to function, as long as ordinary Americans continued to resist, the British could not win.
The commissioners sent by Lord North to offer terms of reconciliation arrived too late and with too little. Their offers of representation in Parliament, of autonomy in internal affairs, of everything except independence, might have been accepted with gratitude in 1774. By 1778, they were meaningless. America had declared its independence, suffered for that independence, won recognition of that independence from a major European power, and was not about to surrender it for vague promises from a government that had repeatedly proved itself untrustworthy. The unanimous rejection of the commissioners' overtures by Congress reflected the settled conviction of the American people that there could be no turning back. The war would continue for 3 more years. There would be victories and defeats, moments of hope and periods of despair. The British would shift their strategy to the southern states where they believed loyalist sentiment was stronger. They would win battles and occupy cities only to discover that the same principles that had frustrated them in the north applied in the south. The French alliance would bear its full fruit at Yorktown, where a French fleet and a Franco-American army would trap Cornwallis and force the surrender that effectively ended the war. But the essential outcome was determined in the spring and summer of 1778. The alliance with France ensured that Britain would face not just a colonial rebellion, but a major European war. The defense of Philadelphia demonstrated that the Continental Army, despite all its hardships, could not be dislodged from positions it chose to hold. The evacuation of Philadelphia showed that Britain lacked the resources to occupy and control hostile territory. The Battle of Monmouth proved that American soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars and emerge victorious. And the rejection of the Peace Commission made clear that Americans would accept nothing less than complete independence. The story of how America won its independence is often told as a tale of battles and generals, of Bunker Hill and Saratoga, of Valley Forge and Yorktown, but it is equally a story of diplomacy and alliance, of the willingness of France to gamble its treasure and eventually its blood on the success of the American cause. It is a story of how the contradictions within British political life prevented the effective prosecution of the war.
It is a story of how the same Enlightenment ideas that inspired the American Revolution were fermenting in France and would soon explode with world-changing consequences. In agriculture, in mechanic handicrafts, the New World had been led to many improvements of implements, tools, and machines, leading experience by the hand to many discoveries. The same spirit of innovation and improvement that characterized American practical arts would be applied to the science of government. The great experiment in Republican self-governance that began with the Declaration of Independence would continue through the Articles of Confederation, through the Constitutional Convention, through the early years of the Republic under Washington and his successors. The alliance with France made that experiment possible. The courage and determination of ordinary Americans made it succeed. If this deep dive into a pivotal chapter of American history resonated with you, smash that subscribe button and hit the like. We're uncovering the stories that textbooks skip, the moments that truly shaped our nation. More untold history is coming your way.